Hi, my name's Therea Roberts and welcome to Body Talks. Today we're going to be learning about the nervous system. So the nervous system is a type of control and communication system within the body which helps the body sort of respond to any internal and external stimuli from the environment. So nervous system is made up of the central nervous system, which is our brain and our spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which is everything else. So that's our two main parts: central nervous system in the center of the body, brain and spinal cord, peripheral nervous system, everything else. So there's actually more branches and subdivisions to the nervous system. So I'm just going to draw these out in case you come across any sort of further terms that you've not heard about. So if we have the nervous system, and I've just said the central nervous system, which gets abbreviated to CNS, consists of our brain and our spinal cord. So it's in the center of the body. And then the peripheral nervous system, I said, is everything else. So peripheral. I'll just put NS for short, our peripheral nervous system. This gets subdivided again into our somatic nervous system, NS, and autonomic nervous system. Now, the somatic nervous system is under voluntary control. If I decide to kick my leg out or lift my arm or hold a cup or something, that's all under voluntary control. I consciously decide to do that, and it's my skeletal muscles that carry out that action. The autonomic nervous system is under involuntary control. Think of the word automatic. So basically, heart rate, breathing rate, digestion is all under autonomic control of the nervous system. So the muscles that are affected there are smooth muscle, which you find all throughout the digestive tract, the bladder, the blood vessels. All of the smooth muscle is under autonomic control. And then we have the cardiac muscle in the heart. So our heart rate, we don't have to tell our heart to keep beating, and we don't have to tell our lungs to keep breathing or anything. So that's all automatic, is under autonomic control of the nervous system. And this branch of the nervous system gets further subdivided into sympathetic and then parasympathetic. I'm just going to move that over. Parasympathetic. So the sympathetic part of the nervous system gets referred to as our fight or flight response. So it's what comes into play if I'm in danger or somebody jumps out at me from behind a bush and I get a fright. My pupils will dilate to take in more danger, be able to see more. My heart rate will start increasing. My breathing rate will become more rapid. My digestive system will kind of be inhibited. I won't be needing to digest my food if I'm in danger and I need to fight or run away. So the sympathetic nervous system is our fight or flight, whereas the parasympathetic nervous system gets referred to as our rest and digest. So if I find out I'm not in danger, say it was my friend just playing a trick on me, jumping out from a bush, and I realise I'm okay and I'm safe, then my heart rate can start slowing down, my breathing rate can start slowing down, digestive processes can start happening again. So it's our rest and digest, when you're out of danger. And these two systems, sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions, they kind of work happily in balance with each other. So they have sort of opposing actions. So hopefully that kind of clarifies the different divisions of the nervous system. And so the brain is obviously part of the central nervous system, and it's split into various sections within the brain. We've got the cerebrum, which is the largest part of the brain, involved in all our thinking, our planning, our intelligence, our reasoning. Then we've got the cerebellum, which sits at the back of the brain. So if this was where it says the front here, this is the front, this is where our eyes would be. And then this cerebrum is this big, large part of the brain. And the cerebellum is this sort of walnut-shaped looking thing at the back of the brain. And the cerebellum is involved in posture, balance, muscular coordination and control. It's also involved in motor memory. So how you remember how to ride a bike after years and years of not being on one, things like that. Then we have the medulla, which sits at the top of the spinal cord. So it's just in this sort of area. This area is called the brainstem, which sits at the top of the spinal cord. And the medulla is involved in our unconscious processes. So it helps control heart rate, breathing rate, blood pressure, things like that, all the things that we don't have to think about. So it's under involuntary control via our autonomic nervous system. Other parts of the brain include the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, which you can't actually see here, but the hypothalamus just sits above the roof of our mouth, and the pituitary gland, which is made up of two lobes, sits just underneath the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus and the pituitary gland work closely together to maintain homeostasis within the body, a stable internal environment. And I cover that in my endocrine system video if you want to take a look at that. So the three main parts of the brain are the cerebrum, which controls all our mental processes, memory, reasoning, imagination, conscious thought, intelligence, planning. So that is that large part, that highly folded part of the brain. The cerebellum sits at the back of the brain, that walnut-shaped organ-looking thing. It controls muscular coordination, posture, balance, motor memory, and the medulla, which sits at the top of the spinal cord, and it controls all our unconscious processes, our heart rate, our breathing rate, and our blood pressure. So the way that I remember, if you have to remember these different parts of the brain, the way that I remember the difference between the medulla and the cerebellum and things is by the way that I write them out. So there's lots of different terms to remember in biology. So when I'm thinking about the medulla, the way I write my M's is a sort of curved way. So medulla would look like this. And so because my M's are curved rather than jaggy like so, I think of that as the start of a heart. So if you imagine this was a heart, so you're kind of curving round. So my top M looks like the top of a heart structure. So I think heart straight away there. And then I remember, heart rate. And then I think, right, that's under unconscious control. Then I think breathing rate. And then I think of everything else that we don't have to think about, like blood pressure and things. So that's the way I remember the M being sort of heart-shaped for medulla. For the cerebellum, let's just write that out first. Cerebellum. I think of the word balance. So B and L. So I think of the word balance. And I know that we need balance to control our posture. And then it just comes to me, then I remember muscular coordination, posture, muscular control, and then the rest just comes to me, motor memory. And then the cerebrum being the largest part, hopefully, is already okay to remember. So, previously, before we had fancy CAT scans and functional MRIs, we only found out what different parts of the brain did by anyone who'd had sort of brain injuries. So scientists and doctors and things, they kind of worked out what happened, what different areas of the brain controlled what by someone who'd had a brain injury of some sort, and that area of the brain was affected, and then they found out they could no longer I don't know, control balance, or they could no longer hear properly, or things like that. So there's different, the brain gets divided into these different lobes. So the frontal lobe, just like you would think, is at the front. So it controls all our executive functions, our thinking, our planning, problem solving. It can also control emotions, behavior, judgments, things like that. So people who've had damage in their frontal lobe can sometimes their personality can change. Maybe they'll become more moody or more aggressive and things. The motor cortex, this area is involved in movement. Sensory cortex controls all our sensations, which are processed by the brain. The parietal lobe helps us make sense of the world. It's involved in arithmetic, our spelling. It manages sensations, our handwriting, body position, things like that for the parietal lobe. The occipital lobe, which sits at the back of the brain just above the cerebellum, which we've already looked at, kind of contains our brain's visual processing system to help us see. And then the temporal lobe, which is at the side here, on both sides of the brain, is involved in our memory, understanding language, also our auditory processes. That's how we're able to process sounds and hear things and things like that. So neurons, it's just a fancy word for a nerve cell. And a nerve cell is basically the way that electrical impulses, which also get referred to as action potentials, are sent via the nervous system. So I'm going to show you a typical nerve cell, first of all, just to help you understand what a nerve cell actually is. So when I'm talking about neurons, a neuron is just a nerve cell, and a typical nerve cell has all the same sort of structures. So here is my typical nerve cell. In this case, I mean, all nerve cells have a cell body. So this part here is the cell body. And then this would be our nucleus, this dark center in the dark circle in the center. So the cell body contains all the things you would expect to find in a typical cell. So mitochondria, ribosomes, cytoplasm, Golgi body, all the typical things you would find in a normal cell are found within the cell body of a nerve cell. The cell body also has these sort of extensions branching off from it. These are called dendrites. And they receive information from receptors and take that information in the form of an electrical impulse towards the cell body. Then we have this big sort of long extension here, which is it's like a big long extension from the cytoplasm, this sort of lilac-y purple bit. This is what we call the axon. So it leads out. So if there was an electrical signal that was received by the dendrites, it's taken towards the cell body and then passes along this axon. It actually jumps between these little spaces that you see. That's how the electrical impulse sort of travels within these spaces. These little gaps are referred to as nodes of Ranvier. And the impulse sort of jumps between the two, where you find sort of protein channels, ion channels and things in between there. And then, so the signal is carried all the way along the axon towards what we call the axon terminals. These little buds at the end here are our axon terminals. So you'll notice that the axon is surrounded by these blue little cells. These are referred to as Schwann cells. Schwann cells. And these make up what we call the myelin sheath. So they are this fatty insulating layer which protects the axon. Each one, so that's the nucleus here, the nucleus of the Schwann cell. Each one, this is one Schwann cell, this is 2, 3, 4, 5. Each Schwann cell is just one cell wrapped tightly around the axon over and over again, so that it's got this protective layer. So thinking about cable wires, where you've got the wires in the middle and the plastic on the outside, the plastic's acting like the myelin sheath of a nerve cell, protecting the internal wires or the axon in the case of a neuron. So the Schwann cells make up the fatty layer of the myelin sheath to protect and also help help generate that impulse all the way along the axon towards the axon terminals. So this type of cell here that we're looking at is what we refer to as a motor neuron. There's three main types of neurons we're going to cover in this PowerPoint: sensory neurons, interneurons, and motor neurons. And the motor neuron always has its cell body to one side, but sensory and interneurons, the cell body can be in the middle or either side of the axon and the dendrites. So this is a typical motor neuron that you're seeing here, but they all have the same structure: the cell body, the dendrites, the axon, the myelin sheath, etc. Some nerve cells don't have a myelin sheath, some of the supporting cells of the nervous system. But we're looking at just typical neurons in a neural pathway just now. So neurons send electrical impulses or action potentials to and from and within the central nervous system. They come in various shapes and sizes, but they all have that same basic structure that I showed you there. So the information is transmitted from one nerve cell or one neuron to another across a tiny gap called a synapse. So nerve cells never ever touch. There's always a tiny space between them, like a junction, where there is a neurotransmitter signal which diffuses across from one neuron to the next to keep the signal going. So here is our different types of neurons: the sensory, relay, and motor neurons. So the sensory neuron at the top there, you can see the cell body is sort of in the middle. This is a sort of long, these are the dendrites on the left-hand side here, and this is a sort of long extension of the dendrite. Then we come across the cell body, and then this is the axon here leading out towards the axon terminals. You can see the direction of the impulse goes from left to right in all cases here. The relay neuron would be found in the central nervous system, so either the brain or the spinal cord. And this neuron also gets referred to as an interneuron or an association neuron. Just if you're looking at other textbooks or looking at other videos, you might hear the relay neuron referred to as an association neuron or an interneuron as well. And I use them all kind of interchangeably. So they have much shorter axons. Some of them just kind of look more star-shaped, but they still have the same structure: the cell body, the axon terminals. And then the motor neuron is the one I drew there on the whiteboard. We've got our dendrites on the left-hand side here, which take the action potential or electrical impulse in towards the cell body, and then that signal travels along the axon towards the axon terminals. So here would be the microscopic gap, the synapse, where there would either be another neuron there or a muscle cell or something to attach to. So they all have the same basic structure, each of these neurons. So the axon terminal, basically the signal kind of travels towards the axon terminal, and then there are calcium ion gates, which let calcium into the axon terminal, and this stimulates little vesicles within the axon terminal to fuse with what we call the presynaptic membrane. So the first neuron in the pathway is referred to as the presynaptic neuron, and then the neurotransmitters which were held within the vesicles diffuse across and bind to receptors on what we call the postsynaptic neuron, so the next neuron in the pathway. So you can see these little receptors here. This is the junction between two neurons called the synapse. So these vesicles, they need calcium and they need electrical impulse to be stimulated to fuse with the presynaptic membrane. The neurotransmitter could be anything like dopamine, serotonin, acetylcholine. It could be any sort of chemical message which diffuses across, binds to receptors on the postsynaptic membrane, and then the impulse continues onwards towards until it produces the effect that's required by the body. So as you can see, it starts off as a sort of electrical impulse. At the synapse, it kind of changes to a chemical message for a short period of time while that neurotransmitter diffuses across to the receptors, and then it changes back into an action potential or electrical impulse to finish off the pathway. So our senses. So remember, your senses are taking in information from the environment and converting that information into electrical impulses that are then sent to the brain via the sensory nerves. So we have our 5 different senses within the body. We've got receptors in our skin which respond to touch, pressure, pain, hot, cold. We've got light receptors in the back of our eyes. So we've got cones and rods in there. So the rods are basically detecting if it's like dimly lit, it's helping us to see better, and the cones are helping us process colour. The position receptors in our ears help with balance. We've got sound receptors in our ear helping with sound vibrations, and we've got chemical receptors in our nose, sort of our olfactory nerves detecting our sense of smell, like chemicals, car fumes, air fresheners, perfumes and things. We're taking these in via the senses. Our tongue has taste buds on there, detecting different flavours like sour, sweet, salty, bitter. All of these senses are taking in information via receptors, which are first stimulated, and then that information is transferred via what we call a sensory pathway. And the sensory pathway is just the first neurons in the pathway, which are the sensory neurons. So we take in information from the environment via receptors. Receptors send that information via sensory neurons towards the brain and the spinal cord. The brain and the spinal cord are referred to as the integrating center. They integrate that information and basically process it and decide what to do with that information. They'll then send a signal towards effector organs, which are either muscles or glands. So, and then we'll produce a response. We'll either move, we'll have contraction of the muscle, or one of the glands might secrete a particular hormone or something. So the flow of information or a neural pathway involves receptors in our sense organs first being stimulated by the environment. So our eyes, our ears, our skin detecting heat, pain, pressure, etc. The information will be converted into an electrical impulse, and it will travel via an action potential through sensory nerves towards the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord. Inside the brain and spinal cord, we have those interneurons or association neurons or relay neurons, and they decide what to do with that information basically, and will send that information towards motor neurons, which are involved in our motor pathway. And then these motor neurons will send out that information towards effector organs, which is our muscles and glands, to produce a response in the body, whether it's muscle contraction or secretion of some sort of hormone or substance from the gland. So that is the general flow of information from receptors to effectors to produce a response in the body via the nervous system. So reflex reactions. A reflex action is defined as a rapid, predictable, unpremeditated, involuntary response to a stimulus. So we all have these inbuilt hereditary responses because sometimes our normal body processes, we wouldn't react fast enough if we had to consciously think about what was happening all the time without having these inbuilt reflex actions. So we bypass the cognitive processes in order to save time. So basically it happens without us thinking about it. If I put my hand onto a burning flame, then I will automatically withdraw my hand away without me consciously thinking about it. This sort of protects my body from any more damage that could have happened if I'd had to have time to process what was happening, feeling hot, heat there. Oh, right, I can feel myself burn. Okay, now I'll move my hand away. But if it's an automatic inherited response that you don't think about and it bypasses conscious thinking, then you protect your skin layers from being burned. So you save time, and it basically is a form of protection. These reflex actions are inside inherited responses to basically provide protection within the body. So they're not dependent on us learning a response, and their whole purpose is protection. So a typical reflex arc shows the pathway of a stimulus. So something in the environment is detected by our sense organs and then passed along a sensory neuron towards the integrating center, which is our central nervous system. So in the case of a reflex action, mostly all reflex actions go through the spinal cord. We're bypassing the brain, going directly through the spinal cord in order to produce a response faster. Eventually, yes, our brain catches up with what's happened and we're consciously aware that we nearly burnt our hand, or we did burn our hand a small bit. So eventually our brain does catch up with it. But initially that hand withdrawal was involuntary. It happened as a reflex action. So stimulus from the environment sent via a sensory neuron into the spinal cord, where there are interneurons. And then the interneuron will pass its electrical message onto the motor neuron to produce an effect in the muscle. So for the hand withdrawal, it's basically causing muscle contraction, moving your hand away from the danger. Here is that hand withdrawal reflex action. There's the flame, there's a little candle flame here. So the receptors are stimulated, the response is automatic, it bypasses the brain. There's an electrical impulse sent directly into the spinal cord, no brain involved here. Hand withdrawal, muscle contraction naturally happens once the motor neuron reaches the muscle, the affected organ, and then you'll naturally move your hand away. Another example is the knee jerk reaction. In this case, it's where the stretch receptors in the muscle of the knee are stimulated by just tapping on the tendon just below the kneecap. So you've maybe had that done at the doctor's or something. They just tap below your kneecap and then it stimulates the stretch receptors. It's an automatic reflex action where your leg will just jerk forward. So it's an automatic response. It bypasses the brain. A sensory neuron is stimulated directly into the spinal cord where the interneuron is, and out through the motor neuron towards the muscles in the knee, which cause the leg to jerk forward. That's another example. Here's another one, the pupil light reflex. So in dim light, our pupils are dilated to allow more light in and help us to see more. Whereas if someone was to shine a torch or something on your eye, maybe the doctor's done that, your pupils will constrict to protect the sensitive cones and rods at the back of the eye. Other examples of reflex reactions include the blink reflex, so touching the eye, or I don't know, dust, if it's a windy day, dust being blown towards the eye, or somebody throwing something towards your eyes, you'll automatically blink to protect your eye from any sort of damage. The gag and swallow reflexes are there. So if you look at my digestive system video, you'll see how I talk about digesting food firstly in the mouth with your teeth and your tongue, and you're sort of chewing and making the food more malleable, breaking it down into smaller pieces. And then that's all voluntary. But as soon as the food hits the back of the throat, we've got the gagging reflex and the swallow reflex to help make sure that food doesn't remain stuck at the back of the throat. So the gag reflex protects you from choking, so the muscles in the throat will contract, and then the swallow reflex will automatically swallow when the food reaches a certain point, again to help you prevent you from choking. And then from there, everything is involuntary. So it's voluntary to start with when we start chewing the food, but as soon as we hit that gag and swallow reflex, the food will just continue its pathway all involuntary after that. And then the mammal diving reflex, if you're in cold water, deep sea divers or whatever, their heart rate will start to automatically slow down to allow them to survive for longer under the water. So you can investigate the reaction time. So reaction times measure the length of time it takes your nervous system to respond to a stimulus. And you can do this by dropping a ruler. So the shorter the distance the ruler is caught, the better the reaction time of the person. So you can have a friend, you can work in pairs, and one of you can drop the ruler, the other one can catch it. You can try both hands, left and right, see which one is better for reaction time. Usually it's your dominant hand, and basically test the reaction times of each person. And there's things, so what factors do you think could affect a person's reaction time? Well, lots of things. So tiredness can slow down your reaction time. Alcohol can also slow down your reaction times. Medications like beta blockers can slow down reaction times. Recreational drugs, cannabis can slow down reaction times. We can also speed up reaction times. So Caffeine can help increase your reaction time. Drugs like amphetamines can all increase reaction times. So even mood, depression and things can slow it down. There's lots of different things that can affect a person's reaction time. So homeostasis keeps your body's internal conditions within narrow physiological limits. That's what the body's always trying to do. It's always trying to maintain factors within a set point. So we're always trying to maintain a normal body temperature. We're trying to maintain normal pH, normal blood volume, normal blood pressure. All of this is happening in our body all the time, but things are constantly changing. If we go from a nice, warm, cozy room out into the snow, then our body temperature will start to change. And then there'll be mechanisms in place, negative feedback, which try to restore body back to its optimal conditions. So homeostatic mechanisms act to minimize the difference between the actual and the optimal responses of a system. We want our body at its kind of optimal conditions all the time so that all the systems are working at their best. And negative feedback works hand in hand with homeostasis to basically negate or bring back to normal any deviations from your normal conditions. So normal body temperature, if the temperature deviates, becomes too hot or too cold, negative feedback control mechanisms are in place to try and bring body temperature back to normal. And in the endocrine system video, I talk about regulating blood glucose levels, blood sugar levels, back to normal, back to set point, our optimal conditions. Our pH, our blood pressure, our water levels in the body, all are changing all day long, but we want to maintain a stable internal environment so that all our metabolic processes are carried out at their best all the time. So homeostasis and negative feedback are two mechanisms that work hand in hand, both in the nervous system and in the endocrine system. So here are components of a homeostatic control system. So basically, we've got our normal set point, our reference point. So I was talking about body temperature being 37 degrees centigrade. Then if we become too hot or too cold, we've got thermoreceptors in our hypothalamus, which are detecting any changes all the time. So receptors will detect any changes and it will send information in the form of electrical impulses towards the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord. Then the central nervous system will integrate that information, process it and decide what to do with it and send a message out via a motor neuron towards a muscle or a gland, which we refer to as our effector organs, and this will produce a response in the body, either sort of raising our body temperature back up if we're too cold or vice versa if we're too hot. So basically that's it for the nervous system. If you've got any questions, please leave some comments below, but I hope that was helpful. I hope you enjoyed it, and please, if you like the videos, please like and subscribe and let me know if there's any other body systems that you want covered, and I'll try and do a video on them to help. Hope you enjoyed that. Thank you.